Okay, so in this video we are going to go over the hyoid bone, the clavicle, the scapula, and the sternum, which is the very final bone on the second page of our list. There's not much to know about the hyoid bone, which is nice. It's going to be this kind of floating bone that will be in front of C3, C4, to kind of give you an idea of where it is. And it is kind of held in its spot by quite a few muscles. So here's an anterior view, and if we isolate it, our next bone is the clavicle. Let's check out the right clavicle. And there are two parts you'll need to know. The acromial end is lateral, so this is a anterior view. So the spine, the midline, is on this side, so this is medial, this is lateral. And the acromial end is on the lateral end, and it will articulate with the acromion of the scapula, which we will see very soon. The opposite end is going to be the sternal end, right here, and that will articulate with the sternum. So this is the medial side of the bone. So how can you tell which end is which? Well, if you look at it from a superior aspect, you can kind of tell that the acromial end is kind of flatter. Whereas the sternal end kind of goes up and down vertically. Where here that's more of a horizontal angle. So be able to differentiate between the two. So to give you a sense of where it articulates, the sternal end will articulate with the sternum, and the acromial end will articulate with the acromion. So let's look at the scapula. The two major processes of the scapula are going to be the acromion. So this here is a anterior view. Kind of the first thing you want to do when you have the scapula in your hands, or you have a picture of it, you want to try to differentiate between medial and lateral, and anterior versus posterior. How can you do that? Well, just remember that the lateral side will have both of the processes, and the medial side will have the medial border, which we'll identify. So that way I can tell, all right, this one goes, that goes to the left, that goes to the right, medial, lateral. And then am I looking at this from a anterior or posterior view? Well, the anterior is going to have this very large fossa, this shallow depression with nothing in the way. The posterior side is going to have the spine, which we'll identify in a second. But the spine divides these two fossa. All right, so back to the terms. The acromion is going to be this process right here, which is on the posterior side. And as you saw before, it articulates with the acromial end of the clavicle. The coracoid process is on the anterior aspect, on the lateral end, and is that process right there, the coracoid process. So here's a lateral view. Your humerus would articulate right in there. That's the coracoid process and the acromion. The glenoid cavity is this depression in here where the humerus will actually articulate. So the humerus will stick right in there. That is our glenoid cavity. So for our next two terms, the supra and infraspinous fossa, let's identify the spine real quick. And that is this surface right here that runs from the medial to the lateral side and kind of becomes the acromion. So that is the spine of the scapula. Now remember, supra is above, infra is below, so the supra above spinous of the spine, fossa, a shallow depression, is this depression right here. And here's a good angle where you can kind of see that shallow depression. So that is the supraspinous fossa. Of the scapula. And remember, you're going to want to get into the habit of writing out the full kind of name of the part or the surface in addition to the bone. So if this were being pointed at on a quiz or on the practical, you would want to say the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. Infraspinous fossa, so below the spine, is this entire fossa right here. And again, here's an angle where you can kind of see the depression. So that's why it's a fossa. And remember, we're looking at this from a posterior aspect. This is medial. This is lateral. So the humerus would be here, and this would be heading towards the spine. So let's talk about the medial and lateral border, since we kind of just identified which side is which. The medial border is going to run along the medial aspect right here. We can highlight it right there in magenta. So that entire border there is the medial border of the scapula. And on the flip side, we'll have the lateral border of the scapula. Superior and inferior angle, just kind of a pointy end. Remember, you have the angle of the mandible. Well, now you have the superior, at the top, angle of the scapula. And that's how you'll want to write it down. Superior angle of the scapula. And then your inferior angle at the bottom. Once you get used to the terms, you realize that a lot of these terms are simply just describing what the surface or what the part is. So we already went over the spine of the scapula. That's this surface right here. Our next term is the suprascapular notch. So supra, we know we're expecting to see something towards the top, and a notch tends to be these little kind of inward angles. And indeed, if we hunt around in there, this is our suprascapular notch. It lies along the superior border of the scapula. That's a term you do not need to know. But here's our superior border. This is the coracoid process, and the suprascapular notch is right in there. And then our final term for the scapula is the infraglenoid tubercle. So Here's the glenoid cavity, infra, below the glenoid. So there it is, the infraglenoid tubercle. And a tubercle is kind of a small round protuberance where muscles will attach. And this is the attachment site for your triceps. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to insert the long head of the triceps. Back on the other side. And I'll isolate the scapula and the triceps, the long head of the triceps, and you can see where it inserts will be right at the infraglenoid tubercle. So it's that area right there, runs along the lateral border, and sits below the glenoid cavity. So now I'm going to skip to the very end of our terms for the appendicular skeleton. We're just going to look at the sternum. I decided to do that because they're all kind of in the same area and they all kind of articulate with each other. So here's our sternum. Three major components. The superior most side is the manubrium of the sternum. The larger segment is known as the body of the sternum. And the inferior most part is known as the xiphoid process. So manubrium, body, xiphoid. And you would write that as xiphoid process of the sternum. The sternal angle sets apart the manubrium from the body of the sternum. And it is this part right there in magenta. Dr. Wilson and Dr. Skinnichia will sometimes refer to it as the angle of Lewis. And it is an example of a symphysis joint. Be sure to know your joints, your joint types. And then the other important surface to know is the jugular notch, which is all the way at the top here. This is on our superior side. Remember, notches are those kind of inward angles. And that is our jugular notch at the very top of the superior aspect of our manubrium. And I think it's helpful to put in the arterial and venous systems because the jugular does not actually go through there, despite being called the jugular notch. Right? Our jugulars are right here off of the brachiocephalic veins. So let that give you a sense of what is just deep to the jugular notch. So then what I'll quickly do is just isolate all those parts that we were talking about to see how they all fit together. So sternum, manubrium, body, xiphoid process, sternal angle, jugular notch, clavicle, sternal end, acromial end, scapula, have the acromion, the coracoid process, the glenoid cavity in there, this is the humerus, the supraspinous fossa, the infraspinous fossa, medial border, the lateral border, the superior angle, the inferior angle, the spine of the scapula, the subscapular notch, the suprascapular notch right in there, and the infraglenoid tubercle.